Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi.
I'm Zara.
One of Victoria's oldest cold cases is one step closer to finally being solved. This week, 65-year-old man Perry Kouroumblis was charged with the murders of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett at their home on Easey Street in Collingwood, Melbourne in 1977. Commonly referred to as the Easey Street murders, this has been labelled Victoria's most serious and longest cold case by Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Shane Patton.
Billi, I'm going to be real with you. I had never heard of this case. I've seen headlines over the past few weeks about it, but I had never done a deep dive of my own. And so to solve that, you did send me articles that you wrote about it as a journalist several years ago. So you are the expert on this story. What do I need to know about it?
I'm the expert at TDA, but definitely not the
true.
expert
Sorry, good
beyond
clarification.
TDA. My theory is that most people who grew up in Melbourne have heard of this case, but a lot of people elsewhere in the country, like you, Zara, or at least young people who weren't around when these murders occurred, they haven't heard of this. But like I said, it's one of Victoria's most notorious murders, and what's been most captivating has been that authorities have never given up on trying to find out what exactly happened to these two women.
So you said that it was 50 years ago. For anyone that perhaps hasn't followed that story from its beginning to now, what do we need to understand about it?
So this all happened in January 1977. It was then that the bodies of 28-year-old Suzanne Armstrong and 27-year-old Susan Bartlett, so our ages now, Zara, they were so young, their bodies were found. Now, their bodies were found on the 13th of Jan, and the pair had last been seen alive on the evening of the 10th of Jan. So that's a 3-day difference, and they believe that they were murdered on the 10th of January. But like I said, their bodies weren't found until 3 days later. When they were found, it was clear that they had suffered from a very horrific homicide. There were multiple stab wounds. Some reports say that they had been stabbed up to 82 times. One police officer this week actually said that it was an absolutely gruesome, horrific and frenzied homicide. So inside this 3-bedroom house that they were living in at the time, you know, I don't want to go into the details, but it was just horrific. Blood everywhere. I mean, you can only imagine what 82 stab wounds would do to the scene of that crime. Also, Suzanne's 16-month-old son was found in the home. His name was Gregory, and he was found unharmed. So he was alive, and it's understood that he had just been there in his cot for the 3 days after these murders happened.
Okay, so you've set the scene, which is an incredibly gruesome one, a horrific one. There are these 3 days that are kind of unaccounted for. Is what happened next that a murder investigation was immediately started?
Yeah, of course. Police immediately started to try to understand what had possibly happened. There were a few details. There was something like a few different people had potentially come and gone from that house during those 3 days, but they said that they hadn't actually entered the house beyond the kitchen, so they actually hadn't seen the women. Obviously, this is also before phones and a lot of technology.
Course. An entirely different,
so it's kind of hard to understand how you could possibly enter the house and leave. But, you know, there were all of these different stories that really made this a complex case. We know that there were a number of different suspects, but obviously police couldn't determine exactly what had happened. And, you know, nearly 50 years later, only now has there been the first charge in relation to these murders. We do know that this man, Perry Kouroumblis, was a person of interest early on, but like the other suspects, police obviously didn't have enough evidence to charge him at the time. Then in January 2017, so what's that, 40 years after, police announced a $1 million reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone responsible for the deaths of the two women.
Why that long afterwards? Like, what changed? If it became a cold case, they weren't able to build enough evidence to charge anyone? Or what happened in 2017 that there was enough interest to reopen this and to have a reward like that?
I mean, I think there's always been interest in the case. I know that in 2015, they appointed a new police officer to lead the cold case.
Okay.
But it was just always an ongoing investigation. And clearly in 2017, they must have thought that some information came across their desk that meant that they were potentially closer. What we also know happened in 2017 is that Police did believe that Kouroumblis, who we've talked about, was still a person of interest, but then he left Australia to live in Greece.
Hi there, my name's Emma. I'm the editor at the Daily Aus, just popping in to say hi and let you know that here at the Daily Aus, we are an independent media company who work to break down the news for young Aussies in a digestible and accessible way. If you like what you're watching and you like what we do, please hit the subscribe button. Now back to the video.
Okay, so in 2017, we understand there's a person of interest, there's a big reward, but then nothing really happens here. Fast forward to 2024, in fact, this week in 2024, where this person that you've just mentioned was a person of interest has now been charged. You just said that he left Australia to live in Greece. What's happened since?
So what is now clear is that at some point between 2017 and this year, police eventually knew that they did want to press charges against this man. But what confused that or made that more complex is that under Greek law, a suspect can't be charged more than 2 decades after the crime they're alleged to have committed, even if that crime was allegedly committed internationally.
So it's like the statute of limitations idea.
So basically they were saying this alleged crime happened too long ago, so you cannot arrest him, press any charges against him. He is safe in Greece.
Okay, so that's interesting because then Australia wouldn't have been able to extradite him. The idea is that he wouldn't have been able to be charged by Australian police in Greece, so they would have had to extradite him home, which they couldn't do because the statute of limitations or whatever it's called there was up.
Exactly. So they tried to do that and they failed because of that law in Greece.
So then what changed?
So then in September this year, Kouroumblis visited Italy for what we understand was probably for a holiday.
Okay.
And when he got on that plane, Australian authorities got alert saying that he's on this plane, and then they immediately alerted Italian authorities to it. And at the airport in Italy, in Rome, he was arrested.
So can I just understand? Clearly then Italy doesn't have the same rules as Greece because once he was out of the, I guess,
protection
of Greek authorities, he then was able to be arrested and then extradited back to Australia?
Yes, which we understand he was confused about because actually one of his lawyers told the ABC in Australia that Kouroumblis was surprised when he was arrested. She said he had no idea he could be stopped and was surprised to be stopped for something that went back to 1977 in Australia. So he did not give any resistance.
Wow.
So he just said, okay, I'll go. Confused.
I mean, it is a very long period of time.
It is a long time, definitely. Now, Zara, like you mentioned, he was then extradited from Italy to Australia to face trial, and he arrived in Australia this week.
And for anyone listening, just to again reiterate what extradition is, that is the formal process that happens between countries. So here we're talking about Italy and Australia. So Australian authorities have requested that he be sent back essentially to Australia to face charges.
Yes.
Billi, a question. This was 50 years ago. Is he an old man now?
So it was nearly 50 years ago.
Okay.
It was about 47 years ago.
Okay.
He is now 65.
Okay.
So that means police are alleging that he was around the age of about 17 or 18 at the time that he allegedly murdered these 2 women.
Okay.
A reminder of their ages. They were 27 and 28.
And did police allege that he knew the 2 women?
Well, we know that he lived just a few hundred meters away from the women at the time. As I mentioned earlier, Kouroumblis is not a new suspect in this case. And so he was actually first interviewed in relation to this murder investigation or these murder investigations shortly after the murders happened. According to The Age in Melbourne, who has been reporting on this story ever since the murders first happened, he was actually investigated shortly after the crime because police had allegedly found a knife in his possession that did have blood on it. But when he was interviewed by police, he said that he had just found that knife at the train tracks and it didn't actually belong to him.
And so then has new evidence emerged? Like if they interviewed him back then, came to the conclusion clearly that there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything, then the passage of a couple of decades goes by and now there's enough evidence to charge him. Like what's changed between now and then?
Police haven't shared too much detail about what exactly was the final thing that meant that they could press charges against him. What I do know is that when this reopened in 2017, they asked him for a DNA sample and he did give that to them.
Okay.
But we don't know what the final thing was that meant that now in 2024 they could press those charges. Important to note that he has always denied any involvement in the case, and still today he maintains his innocence.
And what specifically has he been charged with? So he landed on Australian soil and then a mere matter of hours, I believe it was, later, he was charged. What are those charges?
Days. So he has been charged with 2 counts of murder and also 1 count of rape. So he has also been charged with raping Armstrong. So it's alleged that she was sexually assaulted before she was stabbed to death.
I mean, it's horrific to think that for so long a case like this has gone unsolved. What happens from now?
Well, the case isn't over. This is just the first step now in trying to finally solve it. At this point, what we've detailed here, it's only allegations and it hasn't been proven in court that Kouroumblis murdered these women. He hasn't been found guilty.
And there is the presumption of innocence.
Yes. So the case is due to return to court in February next year. Until then, the court has ruled that there can be no application for bail. So that means that he will remain behind bars until he next appears in court.
I wonder if that's because of a travel risk. Because if he finds himself back in Greece, they can't get him back.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Have we heard from the families of these 2 young women?
Yeah, both of their families have been at court this week whilst this has played out.
What an incredible thing it must be for their families to have thought that for so long they might never see justice. And then, decades later, potentially they could get it.
Yeah, and I can't even, saying that these cases would have defined their lives probably doesn't even touch the surface of how much this would have impacted them. Like I said, both their families have been at court. Susan's brother Martin said the hearing had provided some sense of closure for the family. And the families also released a statement at the time of the arrest. They said, "For 2 quiet families from country Victoria, it has always been impossible to comprehend the needless and violent manner in which Susan and Suzanne died." And to police, they also said, "For always giving us hope and never giving up, we simply say thank you."
Clearly such long-lasting effects for the families and everyone involved with this story. And given now that there is such a major development, it's certainly a story that we're going to watch with close interest and see what happens next. Thanks for explaining, Billi.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus, and we'll be back again tomorrow.